Hello everyone and welcome back to this Delta Module 1 video series. In this video we'll be breaking down the second weightiest task of the exam, that's in terms of marks, and that is Paper 2 Task 2, Analyzing Coursebook Material. This will take you through the whole task, providing key background knowledge and sound exam technique. So let's take a look, shall we? In Paper 2 Task 2, you're provided with an authentic written text of a lesson extract from a published ELT coursebook with a number of exercises. You may be familiar with whichever coursebook you get given, in which case that's a bonus, but likely it will be unknown material. So the lesson extract will typically be from a mainstream general English coursebook following a grammatical syllabus with a PPP methodology: present, practice, produce. The reason being is that it's the most popular and therefore most commercially viable. However, the coursebook could also be an English for academic purposes coursebook, IELTS being the prime candidate for that, or an ESP coursebook, English for specific purposes, business English being the most common here. The extract itself is typically a single self-contained lesson, and that will either be a language systems lesson or a language skills lesson. There are 4 language systems, the other 2 being discourse and phonology, but you're unlikely to get an entire lesson based around those. So for language systems, we've got grammar lessons, vocabulary lessons, and for skills, the reading, writing, speaking, and listening lessons. And along with the lesson extract, the rubric also provides you with what the overall purpose of it is. Some examples: the purpose of the extract as a whole is to enable learners to express obligation and permission. This would be a grammar lesson as we're looking at modal verbs like can, can't, must. To enable learners to talk about quantities, again a grammar lesson, quantifiers, how much, how many, a lot. An example for a vocabulary lesson is the purpose of the extract as a whole is to enable learners to understand and use vocabulary related to invention and design. For a reading lesson, we have to develop and practice intermediate learners' reading skills. And for writing, it's to enable learners to write a promotional poster. Going by past papers, statistically, you're most likely to encounter a grammar lesson and least likely to encounter a listening lesson. So let's take our grammar lesson about quantities and take it through the various analyses of Task 2. But before we do that, let's briefly run through the stages that you are likely to see in a systems lesson. Starting with the lead-in to activate schemata or set the context. This is often discussion questions based on a picture or some kind of context. And then the target language is presented in some way. That's usually in a written text, because in the written text you can see the written form, so it's easier to analyze. The advantage of it being a spoken text is that you can hear the pronunciation features. Either way, this shows the target language being used in context, and there are often some receptive exercises based on that. After presenting, we notice and analyze the target language, which enables learners to identify the target language in the text and focus on the form, meaning, and/or use. This is often done by extracting and underlining the target language, some kind of form completion or sentence completion, as you can see here. Next up is noticing and practicing pronunciation features. It depends on the coursebook. This won't always be there, and it's less likely in a vocab lesson, but if it is there, it enables learners to hear and produce pronunciation features of the target language. Often this is done via listening to an audio and then repeating and/or highlighting certain features. This example is from another lesson, which is focusing on reduction of to ta. Pronunciation doesn't always focus on features of connected speech. It can also be word stress, sentence stress, intonation, or other phonological features. Then we move into the controlled written practice to check and solidify understanding of the meaningful use of the target language, often done via gap fills, short written answers to scaffolded sentence prompts, in this case a gap fill. This is followed by controlled oral practice to focus on the spoken accuracy of the target language, often via single sentence verbal responses from scaffolded prompts. Scaffolded prompt, verbal response. This exercise encourages a bit more language, but likely would only result in single sentence responses, which contrasts with freer oral practice, where we are now allowing the learners to use the target language in a freer way to promote fluency. Various different activities here, and they typically come from less scaffolded prompts. The example here is a survey. So those are the 7 main coursebook stages you're likely to see. This might also be followed up with a freer written practice after the freer oral. And if you are actually planning your own lesson, you might have a warm-up or a review before the lead-in, and you'll have some feedback and error correction at the end. However, these stages don't typically exist in course books. So moving on to the task itself, in the exam booklet, you get the task rubric page and 2 or more pages for the lesson extract. This makes the task the most fiddly of all the tasks in terms of page turning, going back and forth. And going back and forth constantly is a bit annoying and also time consuming. If we blow this up a bit, we can see vocabulary 1A, vocabulary 1B. So we said you are provided with an overall purpose of the lesson extract, and you need to then analyze the exercises contained therein in 3 different ways which correspond to the 3 parts of the task, equating to 42 marks in total, or 21% of the entire exam. In task 2A, you need to identify the purposes of the exercises listed in relation to the overall purpose. This gets you 12 marks and will look like this. Your overall purpose here, and the exercises from the extract listed here. In part B, you need to analyze the links between the exercises listed in part B with those from part A. So you're given a number of new exercises, might just be a couple, might be as many as 5 or 6 like here. And you need to find these links to the exercises in part A, again for 12 marks. And for 2C, you need to identify and comment on the assumptions behind the exercises listed. As stated in the rubric, you also need to explain why these assumptions might be important for language learning, and you also need to explicitly state which exercise you're referring to. This is weightier than part A and B at 18 marks. 18, 12, 12 gives you your total of 42. So let's start with identifying purposes in 2A. First thing to bear in mind is that there are only a finite number of purposes behind writing any coursebook task. And these are the most common for language systems lessons and therefore worth committing to memory. Pause the video now if you want to read each of these, but you'll see most of them crop up shortly anyway. All these purposes should make sense to you, because if you're a coursebook writer and you write an exercise, let's say with the intended purpose to confuse and bore your students instead of engaging them, then your coursebook won't get published, ergo said exercise will not appear in this exam, and you likely won't remain a coursebook writer for much longer.
You're fired.
It's also worth noting that Paper 2 Task 2 is not an exercise in memorization, and you need to spend no small amount of time analysing the exercise. However, having these in the back of your mind when you do is certainly not a bad idea. In terms of the marking for a 2A, 2 marks for each valid purpose across all the exercises indicated, up to a maximum of 6 purposes, getting you your 12 marks. Only write 6 purposes because only the first 6 will be marked. There's no point in writing more. And there will always be more than 6 possible purposes across all exercises, so you don't need to get every single one. You don't need to write at least 1 purpose for each exercise. For example, you could write 3 for reading 2A, 3 for reading 3A, and none for the others. That's fine. You're allowed highlighters in the exam, and it's a good idea to highlight the overall purpose of the lesson so that it's always in the forefront of your mind. Another good idea is to highlight the exercises in different colors in the rubric and also in the extract for ease of reference. As we said before, there's a lot of going back and forth, and the easier you make this for yourself, the better. When structuring your answer, clarify what the target language is at the beginning of the task, note the exercise you're referring to, write each point as 2 plus purpose, and check that the point relates to the overall purpose. So the target language we know from the overall purpose is quantifiers, and we can write it like this. Target language brackets quantifiers equals TL. And we can use TL for the entire rest of the task, and the examiner will know what we are referring to. So in reading 2A, we've got a bunch of numbers here, and the purpose of this is to encourage learners to work out the spoken form of cardinal numbers from examples. When you see exercises with how do you type questions, this is generally to encourage learners to work something out. In reading 3A, learners read and complete the article. So if they're reading a text, the text is contextualizing the target language. This exposes learners receptively to the target language, and it also just simply presents the target language. Now, because we're stating target language here, this is linking back directly to the main lesson aim. However, if you were to write something like to practice reading for specific information, well, this isn't a reading lesson and it's not related to the aim, and therefore this would not get you any marks. For reading 3C, to give controlled oral practice of the target language, Even though the target language hasn't been analyzed at this point, it's still giving controlled practice of at least one example of a quantifier a lot. And this also allows learners to produce examples of that quantifier. I eat a lot of fish, how about you? For grammar 4a and 4b, where students have to complete these sentences and work out the rules, we have a number of purposes to this: to encourage learners to work out the meaning form use of the target language from examples, to focus learners on the meaning form use, to check learners' understanding, to provide learners with a written record, and specifically for this grammar point, to raise awareness of the difference between countable and uncountable nouns. So a number of different valid points to be made here. Taking 6 of those across a range of exercises, and your full answer for task 2a should look something like this. Again, no point writing more than 6 unless you want to come back later and cross out the one you think is least likely to be valid, but you might run out of time and or forget to do that. Going back to our most common purposes, all the ones highlighted appeared in that answer we just went through, so you can see how often these come up. So ones in the same color typically occur together. If you've got a text to contextualize the target language, then you're also exposing learners receptively to it, and indeed you are presenting the target language. If you're giving freer oral practice, well, that also typically allows for personalization, etc. Let's move on to 2b, analyzing links. Again, there are only a finite number of key linking concepts which go into lesson design. For example, to build upon something previously taught or focused on, or to provide language necessary for later tasks. Well-constructed lessons will have a large number of links between exercises, and this increases the overall cohesion of the lesson. And again, these are the most common links you're likely to find, and therefore worth committing to memory. Some of them will refer back to previous exercises, and some forward to future ones. Again, if you want to have a quick read of these, just pause the video now. Mark-wise, you get 2 marks for each valid combination of the exercises indicated, up to a maximum of 6 combinations, giving you 12 marks. Only write 6 combinations, because as before, only the first 6 will be marked, and you don't need to write at least 1 combination for each exercise. Highlight the new exercises in different colors for ease of reference, and if the linking exercises are on the same page, then it's worth just drawing lines to connect them. If on other pages, using different symbols can also be useful. So if we've got to link one or more of these with one or more of these, this is where annotation and highlighting comes in handy. And your test paper might look something like this once you're done. So we've got our reading and our grammar exercises here. The vocabulary exercises are linking into those on the same page. And the practice and speaking exercises are also linking back from the next page. For your answers, use subheadings for the new exercises and link by writing the specific exercise or exercises in part A. Underlining linking exercises is useful so you don't forget to make it. And here we have our vocabulary 1A linking with reading 3C, and we can say vocabulary 1A introduces lexis which can be recycled for reading 3C. I eat a lot of biscuits, for example. Practice 5a, linking to grammar 4a and b, we can say that it gives controlled written practice of the target language focused on in grammar 4a and b, and it solidifies the understanding of the meaning and the form of the target language. For practice 5b and c, this gives controlled oral practice of the form of cardinal numbers focused on in reading 2a. 845, 300 times, for example. Linking B and C with grammar 4a and b, it gives controlled oral practice of the target language focused on in grammar 4a and b, and changes the interaction patterns from individual work here to pair work, and so adds variety. Speaking 6a links with the reading by completing the cycle of receptive and productive started in reading 3a, and it maintains and extends the topic of food and drink to also include exercise. When linking the speaking with the grammar, it gives freer oral practice of the target language focused on in 4a and b. As before, we take 6 links across a range of different exercises, and your answer should look something like this. There will always be more than 6 possible links, probably at least 12, so even if you only get about half of them, you can still gain full marks. From our most common links earlier, you can see the ones that appeared in this task specifically. And lastly, we move on to 2C, commenting on assumptions. The assumptions essentially are what were in the coursebook writers' minds when they constructed the exercise. They are, or should be, based on and justified by current ELT theory and understanding. And they often directly relate to the purpose of the exercise, which you may or may not have already identified in 2A. Learners need to work on accuracy before fluency. So this is your controlled written or oral practice. Why? Because it prevents errors from becoming fossilized in the freer practice which follows. So you can take a look at all of these assumptions by pausing the video now. And some more here. Pause now. For marking, you will get 1 mark for each valid assumption behind the exercise, 1 mark for each valid reason behind said assumption, and 1 mark for stating the exercise it applies to. Again, only write a maximum of 6. 6 times 3 gives you your 18 marks. As in part A and B, only write 6 full points, and you don't need to comment on each exercise. The exercises you're given will typically be a combination of those you've already looked at from part A and B, and there may be some exclusionary material noted for you to avoid. Do not refer to language bank in your answer. Other material like this might be word bank, tips, exam tips, those kind of things. So these 3 exercises you'll remember came from part A of the task, and the practice came from part B. You should structure your answers as the assumption, the applicable exercise in brackets, and the reason below. As we said before, assumptions can often be derived from the purposes identified in part A. So in part A, for reading 3C, we said to give controlled oral practice of the target language. Turn that into an assumption, and we have it is important to provide opportunities for controlled oral practice, reading 3C, because it allows learners to work at their own pace. In C2, we can also see that this question lends itself a bit to personalization. So we can say it's important to allow learners to personalize the language, reading 3C, because it may motivate them to push themselves with language to communicate their real opinion. It's helpful to use a familiar topic like food and drink, because it increases motivation. If it's a topic you're familiar with, you've got lots to say about it, that is in itself motivating. If the topic was about architecture and you couldn't care less about it, then that is not very motivating. For grammar 4A, we had these 2 purposes in part A to encourage learners to work out the meaning. Working something out is cognitively engaging, and cognitively engaging tasks are useful because they encourage learners to process the language forms and leads to greater retention. Another purpose was to provide learners with a written record of the target language. The assumption being that it is important that learners leave a lesson with their own written record of the target language, because this will aid memory. Practice 5B and C were not exercises from part A, however we can still make assumptions about them. We've got some scaffolding going on here. Learners benefit from that because it gives them confidence. This assumption is the same as we had before, and even though it refers to different exercises, you can't repeat the same assumptions. You won't get marks for those. So if you had already written this before, don't write it again. Learners need to work on accuracy before fluency. And then we take 6 of our assumptions, we have the exercise it refers to, and we have provided our reasons here. Task 2, A, B, and C done. And here we looked at a grammar lesson, but the way you would analyze a vocabulary lesson would be very similar. And for language skills lessons, we'll look at those in the next video. Paper 2, Task 2 is the second weightiest of them all, and to get your brain wired towards coursebook analysis, it's a good idea just to pick up any coursebook you use regularly, or any you otherwise have to hand, and just start analyzing the exercises. What the purpose behind them is, what the assumption behind said purpose is, and how they all link together in one way or another to make the lesson a nice cohesive whole. Paper 2 Task 2 is also a useful exercise in analysing your own lesson plans and making sure every stage makes sense in the context of the lesson and that each stage links into and supports those around it. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one for Paper 2 Task 2, where we'll be moving on to analysing language skills lessons, reading, writing, listening, speaking, which require a slightly different approach. See you then.